So this video is kind of in response to the reel that Cory Wong put out on his Instagram a few weeks ago where he said, and I quote, "Gentle call out to all the folks that consider themselves advanced guitarists. You should know where all the notes are on the guitar. Can you play me a C on every string?" This seemed to set the comment section on fire as people came to defend what he had said or to disagree with him, and Jack White himself even commented and said, "Okay, it's a deal. I'll find the C, but I'm not learning all those other notes." So setting that debate aside, because it's a debate that could go on forever, the real question is why? Why is it so common that guitarists don't know how to read music or don't know all the names of the notes? It's generally understood by the general public and other musicians that guitarists can't really read music. And it was even surprising to me when I got into the School of Music at the university I attended that there were other guitarists who could play circles around me when it came to jazz solos and improvisation, yet they still struggled to read basic standard notation or, chord clusters or things like that. So this is something that I explain to almost every student that I teach because it's important to understand why this is and what we should do about it. Now, before I continue, I have to give a little disclaimer. This is definitely a more heady subject.
It's not heady, it's headly.
We're going to talk a lot about culture and history and that sort of thing and how it influences guitar, and we're not going to do any playing at all in this video. However, if you'd like to just see what my summary is at the end, there are, of course, those little chapter markers along the bottom here, so check those out, and if not, let's dive into it. Now, while there are many different reasons why people would choose not to learn to read sheet music or to know all the notes up and down the neck, I feel like I can kind of narrow it down to two main things in history that have made it so that learning notes is not necessarily necessary. The first of those two things is tablature. Now, the general consensus revolving around tabs or tablature is that it was invented by guitarists who were lazy and didn't want to actually learn how to read music. However, that's not necessarily the case. See, tabs go all the way back to the 1300s, and it was actually a primitive form of music notation that just didn't quite catch on. It didn't work as well as what we know as standard notation. However, during the Renaissance and Baroque eras, it did catch on specifically with fretted instruments like lutes. The reason being that, like many guitarists of our day, they all like to change the tunings of their lute, and whenever you do that, the notes suddenly change frets. And so, as they needed a way to write down what they were doing, tab came back up. Lead that all the way up to modern times, and tabs are still very widely used by guitarists for much of the same reason. We like to change tunings, we like to do things where we move notes, and so it's easier to learn via tabs. But honestly, we all have to be real and admit that reading tabs is much easier than reading standard notation. It helps us know exactly what position the guitarist, banjo, or bass player is playing in, and on top of that, it makes the guitar or any fretted instruments widely accessible to anyone who can count to 24. However, we use it at the cost of standard notation. Up next, we're going to take a look at the history of the Western world through the scope of guitar and music in general. If we briefly examine the history of the guitar and honestly skip through a lot of it, we can see that while there are a lot of fretted instruments that weave their way through Western culture, we actually don't definitively see what we know as the modern guitar today show up until about the early 1800s. Even then, it would take another 100 years, good old trade, immigration, colonialism, the Industrial Revolution, the Victorian era, and a lot of other things before we actually see guitar come to the forefront as a mainstream instrument. The reason that this is significant is that in 2025, we are really only in the first couple hundred years of its lifespan. So let's take a look at the violin. The violin is about roughly 500 years old. By the time what we know as the violin was about 100 years old, it was the 1700s. In 1741, Handel composed his world-famous Messiah and heavily relied on violins in that. However, if we move forward another 100 years to 1841, if I'm a violinist and I want to learn Handel's Messiah, the only way to do it is to go find a piece of sheet music that has the part written down on it and learn it from that. You see, the heyday of violin was during a time when Western culture primarily relied on what we would call a visual tradition. A visual tradition is the use of books, images, paper, ink, all that sort of stuff to convey information. So now we're a few hundred years removed from that, and this instrument has settled itself into a visual tradition. Most of the music that violinists play today is primarily from those time periods when the visual tradition was important. On top of that, through standard notation, the composers were able to express not just what notes to play, but the rhythms in which we should play them, the feeling, the tempo, pretty much anything you needed to know to recreate every single thing that they wanted you to play is written in standard notation. Now let's go back to the guitar. I think we can all agree that while there were compositions from the 17 and 1800s that were written for guitar, guitar's heyday is really the mid-1900s all the way up to the present day. Much like the violin, this is roughly 100 to 150 years after it came into being what we know it to be today. And just like violin, through today, it's still being experimented with and written for in new and interesting ways through the advent of pedals, amps, different pickup configurations, different recording technologies and techniques, and so many other things that are likely still to come. This means that we are living through the formative years of this instrument. So, why isn't there any note reading? Well, it's the same reason that bookstores are a dying breed and libraries are falling by the wayside. People aren't reading books anymore, and the reason why is because in the early 1900s, through technological advances, our society started transitioning into what we would call an oral tradition, and eventually also an oral tradition. Think of IKEA furniture. There aren't even words in the instruction booklet. It's just like a really boring adult Lego manual. I recently bought a wall mount for my TV and it didn't even come with an instruction manual. It came with a QR code that led to a YouTube video that the company had put out explaining how to mount it. Guitar is no different. With the advent of radio, vinyl, tape, MTV, digital recording, YouTube, we're moving away from this visual tradition because we can actually listen to or watch a video of the composer, Eddie Van Halen or whoever, actually playing it himself and learn to play it from them instead of having them write down how to play it. This means we can learn to be fairly proficient at guitar without ever having to touch a piece of paper. So why does this matter? To many people, it doesn't. I think of Wes Montgomery, who at 19 picked up the guitar and went on to become one of the most influential jazz guitarists of all time and my personal favorite jazz guitarist. And in addition to that, he never knew a lick of theory and even admitted to not even really understanding how the electronics on his guitar worked. Whenever he was learning a new song, he would sit down with a piano player, have them play through the chords for him, and he would noodle around and find his way, and then he was good to go. But the reason it might matter to you has to do with communication. You see, music at its core is a language. It's used to convey feeling, emotion, information. That's what languages are. However, it is different from other languages in that it's something we do as a communal experience, right? We as a band sit down and try to convey the same message. Four dudes all chilling in a basement. And therein lies the catch. Trying to explain how to cook a specific recipe without really knowing what the names of seasonings are and just trying to explain them based on taste or what you remember them looking like won't necessarily always give you the correct result and will probably take you a lot longer to arrive where you want to be. The same thing goes for music theory and note names. If you want to sit down and teach your band a song that you're learning, knowing the names of the notes and the chord progression and all that sort of fun stuff is pretty crucial. In addition to that, for us mere mortals, learning music theory can help our ears and our understanding catch up to where Wes Montgomery and Eddie Van Halen seem to be right out of the gates. In short, do whatever you want. If you don't want to learn the names of the notes, then don't. There are so many examples of people who didn't know a lick of theory and made lasting impressions on not just music, but society as a whole. But for some of us, it could just be a crutch that we're using so that we don't have to do something hard. I know that for me personally, the more I dove into theory and note names and note reading, the better guitarist I became, and the more gig opportunities I could take on. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below what you think about what we talked about today, or just, whether or not you think guitarists should learn note names or shouldn't. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for being a part of the channel. Please go make someone else's day better. Once again, my name is Mac Wright. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and we will see you around.